Hello and welcome to the Vailrun Tapes. Every story here is true. It happened to a real person, and they wrote it down or said it out loud, so the rest of us would know. Tonight, I'll share a few of them with you. A lot of you come back here every night, and that means a lot to me. These stories stay with people. That's just what they do. Before we start, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. I read all of them. And if you like these stories, a quick like and subscribe really help. Now get comfortable, take a slow breath, and let's begin.
When I was in college, I lived in a big old house with 5 other roommates. It was the kind of house that had probably been beautiful when it was first built, but by the time we lived there, it had a worn-out, slightly haunted feeling, even before anything strange happened. The floors creaked constantly. The doors stuck in their frames. The hallways were narrow and darker than they should have been, even with the lights on. Every room seemed to have its own strange noise. A pipe would knock somewhere in the walls. A floorboard would pop in an empty room. The heating system would kick on with a low groan that sounded almost like somebody dragging furniture across the basement. None of us really thought the house was haunted. We were college students. We mostly complained about the rent, the old appliances, and the fact that there were 6 people sharing one house with a kitchen that was barely big enough for 2 people to stand in at once. Still, the place had a weird atmosphere. It was too big for us, honestly. There were enough bedrooms that everyone had their own space. But the common areas always felt empty unless all of us were home at once. The living room had an old couch that smelled faintly of dust and whatever previous tenants had spilled on it. The kitchen connected to the side of the house through a door that led outside. That door always made me uncomfortable because it opened toward a narrow path beside the house and a patchy backyard that was badly lit at night. The backyard itself was not huge, but it was deep enough that you could not see every part of it from the house after dark. There were uneven patches of grass, a few old shrubs, some broken-looking fencing near the back, and shadows from trees that made the whole space feel larger than it really was. During the day, it was just a messy backyard. At night, it looked like the kind of place where someone could stand still for a long time without being noticed. One weekend, everybody left except me. Some of my roommates went home to visit family. Others had plans out of town. I do not remember exactly where everyone went, only that the house emptied out one person at a time until I was the only one left. The only other living thing in the house was one of my roommate's dogs. She was an adorable pit bull, sweet, friendly, affectionate, and honestly not intimidating at all unless you were a stranger who saw her before you got to know her. She was one of those dogs who looked tough but acted like a giant baby. She loved people, loved attention, and had the kind of face that made it hard to take her seriously when she tried to look angry. I had said I could watch her for the night. It was not a big deal. I liked the dog, and I figured it would be nice not to be alone in that old house. She had a heavy-duty kennel she slept in, and I knew her routine well enough. Take her out, feed her, let her hang around, make sure she did not get into anything. Then put her in the kennel when it was time for bed. The night started normally. I was in the living room watching television with the dog nearby. She was stretched out on the floor at first, relaxed and comfortable. I do not remember what I was watching. Probably something dumb and easy to have on in the background. I had the kind of relaxed mood you get when you have the whole house to yourself and nobody is arguing about the television, using the bathroom, cooking something disgusting in the kitchen, or playing music too loudly in another room. For a while, everything was fine. Then the dog started growling. It was quiet at first, a low, steady sound from deep in her chest. I looked over at her because it was strange. This dog was sweet. She could bark if someone knocked on the front door, but she was not normally aggressive or nervous. She had been lying down only a few minutes earlier, but now she was standing stiffly and staring toward the kitchen. The living room connected directly to the kitchen, and from where I was sitting, I could see part of the doorway. The dog was looking past it. Her ears were up. Her body was tense. The growl got louder. At first, I assumed there was an animal outside. Maybe a cat had come near the side door. Maybe a raccoon was digging through something. Maybe a squirrel or stray dog had wandered through the yard. The side door in the kitchen led outside, and the dog had always been curious about noises coming from that direction. So I got up to check. The moment I entered the kitchen, I felt something was wrong. All the lights were on. Every kitchen light. The overhead light was on. The small light above the stove was on. One of the lights near the sink was on, too. The room was brighter than it should have been, almost glaring after the darker living room. I had not turned any of them on. I was sure of that. I had been watching TV in the living room, and the kitchen had been dark. I would have noticed if the lights had been on because the doorway would have been glowing. But now the entire kitchen was lit up, as if someone had walked in and turned everything on at once. Then I saw the side door. It was open. Not wide open enough to swing freely, but open. The door was pulled away from the frame, leaving a dark gap leading outside. For a moment, I just stood there. The dog stayed behind me, still growling. I remember looking at the open door and trying to decide whether I had forgotten to lock it. Maybe one of my roommates had left it open before they left. Maybe the latch had not caught properly. Maybe the wind had pushed it open. But that did not explain the lights. It also did not explain why the dog was staring toward the kitchen like someone had been there. I walked over to the door. The outside air felt colder against my face. I looked out along the narrow side of the house. There was nothing visible, just darkness, the edge of the yard, and a faint bit of light from a nearby house. I did not step outside at first. I just listened. Nothing, no footsteps, no voices, no rustling in the bushes, no sound of a person moving away. I shut the door. Then I locked it. I checked the lock twice. I turned the handle to make sure it would not open. Then I went around the kitchen and turned off all the lights. The dog stopped growling after a little while, but she did not seem fully relaxed. I went back to the living room. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Old houses have weird doors. Maybe the latch was bad. Maybe the lights had been left on and I had not noticed them. Maybe the dog heard a raccoon or another animal outside. Maybe I had been tired, distracted, or a little high, and had not paid attention to things that were obvious. That was the explanation I kept giving myself. I was tired. I was alone. The house was old. The dog was reacting to some normal outside noise. I kept watching TV, but I could not fully relax after that. Every time I heard the house settle, I looked toward the kitchen. Every time the dog lifted her head, I assumed she heard something near the side door again. I checked my phone. I turned the TV volume down a little. I listened harder than I normally would have. Eventually, it got late enough that I had to take the dog outside before bed. I put on shoes and grabbed whatever I used for her, then went toward the back door. The backyard was dark. There was a small exterior light, but it did not reach far. It lit the area close to the back steps and part of the grass. But the farther end of the yard faded into shadow. The dog walked out first. At first, she seemed normal. She sniffed around, moved through the grass, did what she needed to do. I stood near the door waiting, probably looking at my phone or watching the dark yard because I was already nervous after the kitchen door incident. Then I saw a shadow. It was near the farther part of the backyard. At first, I thought it was a person. The shape looked hunched over, almost like someone crouching or bending down near the ground. It was too dark to make out details, but it had the rough outline of a body, a head, shoulders, something bent forward. I froze. My first thought was that someone had come into the yard. Maybe someone had been near the side door earlier. Maybe they had entered the kitchen, turned the lights on, opened the door, and gone outside before I got there. Maybe they were still around the house. That thought made me angry before it made me scared. I yelled. Something like, "Hey, who's there?" The shape did not answer. The dog noticed it too. She stood still and looked toward the same part of the yard. I could feel the leash tighten slightly in my hand. I yelled again. Still nothing. Then I started walking toward it. That was stupid, but I was scared and angry. I wanted to know whether there was someone in my backyard. I did not want to stand by the door and let them hide there. I kept my eyes fixed on the hunched shape as I moved closer. The grass was uneven, and the outside light did not help much. I took a few steps, then a few more. The shadow was still there. It seemed to be facing away from me or bent over something near the ground. I could not see a face. I could not see what it was doing. I only knew it looked human enough that I kept expecting it to stand up. Then, as I got closer, it disappeared. Not like someone ran away. Not like someone ducked behind a tree. It was just gone. 1 second, I could see a dark, hunched shape in the yard. The next second, there was nothing there. I stopped walking. I stared at the spot. There was no fence close enough for someone to go behind, no large object to hide behind, no shed, no bush big enough to swallow an adult-sized person in a second. The yard was open in that area. I looked around. Nothing. The dog was still watching. That made it worse. If I had been alone, I might have said it was a trick of the light. I might have blamed the trees, the shadows, the uneven lawn, or whatever I had smoked earlier. But the dog had gone tense, too. She had looked directly toward the same part of the yard. I stood there for what felt like a long time. Then I decided I had enough. I brought the dog inside. I checked both doors. I checked the locks. I looked through the living room window toward the yard, but everything outside looked normal. The lawn was empty. The shadows were still where they should have been. There was no hunched person, no movement, and no sign that anyone had been there. At that point, I was thoroughly freaked out. I was convinced I had either seen something that was not there, or that I was just too high and my brain was turning ordinary shadows into people. I had not been drinking. I was not wildly out of it. But I had been smoking, and being alone in an old house can make your mind go places it would not normally go. So I decided to stop thinking about it. I put the dog in her kennel. The kennel was heavy duty. It was not one of those light wire crates a determined dog could push over or bend apart. It was solid, heavy, and secure. Once she was inside and the latch was locked, she could not get out. She had never escaped from it. She was not the type of dog who could quietly open a latch, wander around the house, and then lock herself back in. I made sure she was okay. I closed the kennel. I locked it. Then I went to bed. I did not sleep well. I remember waking up at least once during the night, not because of any obvious sound, but because the house felt too quiet. I lay there listening for movement from the kitchen or hallway. I thought about the open side door. I thought about the lights. I thought about the shadow in the backyard. But I did not get up. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Eventually, I fell asleep again. When I woke up in the morning, the first thing I noticed was the smell. It was strong enough that I knew immediately something was wrong. At first, I thought maybe the dog had gotten sick. I had been watching her overnight, and maybe she had had an accident. Dogs have accidents sometimes. especially in unfamiliar routines or when they are stressed. Then I opened my bedroom door. There was a massive pile of dog poop right outside it. Not a small accident, not something you could reasonably blame on a nervous dog who held it too long. It was huge. I stood there in my doorway staring at it, trying to understand what I was looking at. My first thought was the dog. Obviously, she had to have gotten out of the kennel. Maybe I had not locked it properly. Maybe she had somehow pushed it open. Maybe she had panicked during the night after hearing something outside and made a mess in the house. It was gross, but it would have made sense. I stepped over it carefully and went toward the room where the kennel was. The dog was still inside, locked up, safe and sound. She looked normal. She was sitting there waiting for me, probably happy to see me, completely unaware that I was standing there trying to solve the dumbest mystery of my life. The kennel latch was still locked. The door was closed. There was no sign she had escaped. I checked it anyway. I opened it, closed it, and looked at the latch. There was no way she had gotten out without damaging something, making noise, or leaving the kennel door open. Then I looked at the size of the mess outside my bedroom again. The dog was a decent-sized pit bull, but those piles were enormous. They were almost as big as her head. That might sound exaggerated, but that is how it looked to me. Huge, heavy, ridiculous piles that did not seem possible for one dog to produce overnight, especially after I had taken her outside before bed. I hoped it was only one. It was not. I walked into the rest of the house and found more. There were piles in the kitchen. There were piles in the living room. There were piles in the hallway. By the time I counted, there were probably 8 of them spread around the common areas. 8. Not little accidents. Not a few droppings. Huge, post-Thanksgiving-sized dumps scattered through the house like someone had walked room to room doing it on purpose. I stood in the kitchen, staring at them, completely stunned. For a second, I wondered whether a person had broken into the house. That thought was horrible, but it made more sense than a ghost pooping all over the place. Maybe someone had entered through the side door. Maybe they had been in the kitchen the night before. Maybe the open door and lights were connected to them. Maybe the shadow in the yard had been a person. But if someone had broken in, why would they do that? Why would they turn on the lights, open a side door, lurk in the backyard, and then leave massive piles of poop throughout the house? Nothing had been stolen. Nothing was broken. No windows were damaged. No locks were forced. There were no obvious signs of someone going through rooms, and the dog had been in the house the whole time. Even if she was friendly, I had a hard time imagining a stranger walking around the house long enough to do all that without her barking, growling, or making enough noise to wake me. Then I wondered if it had been me. Maybe I had gotten up in the middle of the night and done something without remembering it. That possibility made me feel sick. Maybe I had been more out of it than I thought. Maybe I had sleepwalked. Maybe I had somehow wandered through the house in the dark, made a complete mess, and returned to bed without remembering any of it. But I had not been drinking. I had smoked earlier, but not enough to erase an entire night. I was on the smaller side, and even if I had eaten something bad, I seriously doubted I could have produced that much in one night. And the piles were in multiple rooms. It was not one accident in the bathroom. It was not one bad night. It looked like several different things had happened all over the house. I had no answer. The dog had not done it. At least, not as far as I could see. She was locked in the kennel. The kennel was secure. I had taken her outside before bed, and the size of the mess did not match what I thought she could physically produce. I checked the side door again. It was still locked from the inside. The kitchen lights were off because I had turned them off the night before. There was no sign that anyone had come in. No muddy footprints, no broken glass, no open windows, nothing. Just the smell, the piles, and the memory of that hunched shadow disappearing from the backyard. I did not tell my roommates. I do not know why. Maybe I was embarrassed. Maybe I thought they would assume I had done it and was blaming the dog. Maybe they would laugh at me. Maybe they would think I was too high and had imagined half of it. I also did not want to tell the dog's owner that something strange happened while I was watching her. I did not want them to think I had let her out or failed to take care of her properly. So I cleaned it all up. Every disgusting pile. I cleaned the hallway. I cleaned the kitchen. I cleaned the living room. I cleaned outside my bedroom door. I aired out the house as best I could. I used whatever cleaning supplies we had. I probably used too much. By the end of it, the whole house smelled like chemicals mixed with something I could not get out of my head. The dog watched me from her kennel at first, then followed me around after I let her out. She looked innocent. She always looked innocent. That made it almost funny, in a horrible way. She would wag her tail and look at me like she had no idea why I was so stressed. Maybe she did not. Maybe she really had nothing to do with it. By the time my roommates came back, the house looked normal. No one asked questions. No one noticed anything strange. I did not bring it up. I acted like the weekend had been completely ordinary. But I have been confused about it ever since. Maybe the dog escaped and somehow got back into the kennel. Maybe she had help from someone, though that seems unlikely. Maybe I had a weird sleepwalking episode and do not remember it. Maybe someone got into the house and did something unbelievably strange for reasons I will never understand. Maybe the shadow in the backyard was an animal, a person, or just my eyes making something out of the darkness. Maybe the lights and open side door were unrelated. Maybe the whole weekend was just a chain of weird but normal events that felt connected because I was alone in a big old house. I honestly do not know. But I remember the order of it too clearly. The dog growling toward the kitchen, the lights all being on, the side door hanging open, the hunched shadow in the yard, the dog locked securely in her heavy-duty kennel, then waking up to an enormous pile outside my bedroom door, and finding 7 or 8 more scattered around the house. It was not the kind of ghost story where something whispered my name or knocked on walls. It was worse in a way, because whatever happened left behind a mess I had to clean up. And I still have no idea who or what was responsible. When I was in my freshman year of high school, we had some strange neighbors. They were a Hispanic family, or at least that was how everyone in the neighborhood described them, because nobody really knew much about them. They never talked to anyone else on the block. Our neighborhood was usually friendly enough. People had block parties, cookouts, yard sales, and little community events. Parents knew each other. Kids moved between houses without much thought. Even people who kept to themselves would usually wave, say hello, or make small talk if they saw you outside. But not the people in that house. They never came to anything. They never stood around talking in their driveway. They never joined the neighbors during gatherings. They did not seem openly rude, exactly. It was more like they had made a decision that they wanted nothing to do with the rest of us. Most people on the block could tell you who lived in which house. They knew the family with the loud dog, the older couple who always planted flowers, the guy who fixed cars in his garage, the parents with the 2 little kids who rode bikes up and down the street. But nobody seemed to know exactly who lived in that house. We knew people lived there. Obviously, lights would come on at night, cars would pull in and out. Sometimes there were sounds from inside. But there was always something slightly confusing about it. There were usually 6 or 7 cars parked in front of the place at night. Not always the same cars, either. One night there might be a dark sedan, an old truck, a white van, and several other vehicles crowded along the curb or in the driveway. Another night, some of those cars would be gone, and different ones would be there. It was hard to tell whether they belonged to the same family, friends, relatives, roommates, or people just stopping by. As a teenager, I did not think too deeply about it. I noticed it, but I did not question it much. Adults have complicated lives. People have visitors. Some families have more cars than others. Maybe several generations lived there. Maybe people worked different shifts. Maybe they had friends over every night. Still, it was odd that no one in the neighborhood could ever say for sure who lived there. Nobody knew how many people were inside. Nobody knew their names. Nobody seemed to have spoken to them more than once, if at all. The house itself was normal looking. It was not some broken down, abandoned place. It was a regular house on a regular suburban street. It had a yard, a driveway, windows, a front porch, and all the same features as the houses around it. But it always felt closed off. The blinds were usually shut. The curtains stayed drawn. The front door rarely opened when anyone was outside. Even when there were several cars parked in front, the house did not look lively. It did not look like people were hanging out in the yard, listening to music, cooking outside, or having friends over. It just looked occupied. That is the best way I can put it. Occupied, but separate. One afternoon, I was walking home from school when I noticed something different. The first thing I saw was that there were no cars parked in front of the house. None. That alone caught my attention, because there were almost always vehicles there. Even if some cars came and went, there was usually at least one parked outside. The driveway and curb were normally crowded enough that you noticed it without trying. But that day, the area in front of the house was empty. No cars in the driveway, no cars along the curb, no van, no truck. Nothing. At first, I thought maybe the family had gone somewhere. Maybe they were on vacation. Maybe they had all gone to a gathering or left town for the weekend. It was unusual, but it was not enough to make me stop walking. Then I looked up at the roof. The house was covered in crows. Not a few crows. Not 10 or 20. Hundreds. There had to have been over 100 of them, maybe more. I did not stand there and count, but I had never seen that many birds in one place in my life. They were everywhere. They covered the roofline. They sat along the gutters. They lined the edges of the porch. They filled the yard. Some were perched on the fence. Some stood in the grass. Some were in the trees closest to the house. They seemed to be concentrated entirely around that one property. That was what made it strange. There were no birds on the houses beside it. No birds on the streetlights. No birds on other rooftops. No huge flock moving across the sky. It was as if every crow in the area had chosen that one house and nowhere else. I stopped walking and watched them for a while. At the time, I honestly thought it was kind of cool. Crows are interesting birds. Even as a kid, I knew they were smart, and there was something impressive about seeing so many of them together. The sound they made was low and constant. Not a loud, chaotic screeching exactly, but a steady mix of caws, wings shifting, claws tapping on the roof, and birds moving from one spot to another. The house looked black from a distance because of them. The roof was dark. The lawn was dark. The porch was dark. Everywhere I looked, there were black shapes sitting still or hopping around. I remember wondering what could have drawn them there. Maybe food had been left outside. Maybe there was garbage somewhere. Maybe a dead animal was in the yard. Maybe something had happened around the house that attracted birds. But I did not see anything obvious. The yard did not look torn up. There were no trash bags ripped open. There was no visible animal carcass. There was no pile of food or anything else that would explain why the crows were gathering there. They were just there, watching, sitting, covering the house. I stood there for a few minutes, then eventually kept walking home. I did not tell anyone about it right away because I did not think it was a big deal. I probably mentioned it casually later. Something like, "There were a ton of crows on that weird neighbor's house today." Maybe someone said that was strange. Maybe nobody cared. At that point, it was just a strange thing I had seen while walking home from school. Then, early the next morning, my mother woke me up. It was around 3 a.m. I remember being confused when she came into my room. It was dark, and I had been asleep deeply enough that it took me a moment to understand why she was there. She told me the neighbor's house was on fire. I got out of bed and went outside. The entire house was burning. Not a small fire in one room. Not smoke coming from a window. The whole place was in flames. The fire lit up the street in a harsh orange glow. Smoke rolled into the sky. Firefighters were already there, trying to get it under control. Their trucks blocked part of the road. Flashing red and blue lights reflected off the nearby houses, cars, and wet pavement. People from the neighborhood were outside watching. Some were standing in robes or pajamas. Some held blankets around themselves. Others were talking quietly in small groups, trying to figure out what had happened. The adults looked scared, but also confused. Everyone knew the house had people living in it, but nobody seemed to know whether anyone was inside. I stood there for a while, looking at the fire. I remember the heat reaching across the street. I remember the loud spray of water. I remember the way the flames moved through the windows, and I remember looking toward the driveway. There were still no cars. The house was burning, but the driveway was empty. No vehicles were parked outside. No one was standing in the yard claiming it was their house. No one came rushing out to explain what happened. No family members appeared. No neighbors ran over saying they had seen someone leave. The whole place was on fire, and yet it felt like the people who lived there had already disappeared. At the time, I did not connect it to the crows. Not fully. I noticed the empty driveway again, but I did not think much further than that. I was still a teenager, standing outside at 3:00 in the morning, watching a house burn down on my street. It was shocking enough on its own. After a while, I went back inside. I could not do anything to help. The firefighters were there. Adults were talking. My mom probably told me to go back to bed because there was school the next day. But I did not sleep much after that. The fire trucks stayed for a long time. The sirens eventually stopped, but there were still lights outside, voices, engines, and the distant sound of people moving around. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the house glowing through the smoke. The next day, everyone in the neighborhood was talking about it. At school, I heard people mention the fire. On the street, adults stood outside and talked in quiet voices. Every version of the story had the same basic problem. Nobody knew what happened to the people who lived there. The firefighters had investigated as much as they could, but they could not give anyone a clear answer. They did not know where the residents were. They did not know whether the family had left before the fire, whether they had been somewhere else, or whether there had ever been as many people inside as everyone assumed. And they could not figure out where the fire had started. That was what people said anyway. The fire had damaged the house so badly that there was little left to work with. The place was unstable and dangerous. Eventually, a large fence went up around the property to keep people out. The house looked destroyed. The windows were gone or broken. Parts of the roof had collapsed. The inside was blackened. The yard was covered in debris and ash. Even from the sidewalk, you could tell it was not safe to get close. For a while, the burned house became the thing everyone noticed when they drove down our street. People would slow down as they passed it. Kids would dare each other to look through the fence. Adults would tell them to stay away. Someone always seemed to have a rumor. Maybe the family had moved suddenly. Maybe the house had been used for something illegal. Maybe nobody had lived there at all. Maybe the people had been gone for weeks and nobody noticed. Maybe they left in the cars before the fire started. Maybe the fire was accidental. Maybe it was not. I never knew what to believe. The strange thing was that there had been so many cars there every night before the fire. The house had seemed busy in its own private way. There had always been people coming and going, or at least vehicles that suggested people were coming and going. Then, suddenly, there were no cars. Then, the crows came. Then, the house burned. A couple of days after the fire, I was walking home from school again. The fence was up by then, or at least part of it was. The house was still standing in the way a ruined house stands, black and open to the sky in places where it should not have been. It looked less like a home and more like the shell of one. As I got closer, I heard the birds, that low, rough sound. Cawing, wings moving, claws shifting across wood and metal. I looked up. The crows were back. Not one or two, not a small group. The same overwhelming number of crows had returned. They covered the damaged house and the yard again. They sat on the burned roofline. They gathered along the fence. They stood in the grass where there was still grass left. They filled the dead branches of the nearby trees. The sight of them was worse than it had been before. Before the fire, I had thought it was interesting. Now it felt wrong. The house was empty. The people were gone. The property had been destroyed. And the crows were all there again, as if they had come back to finish watching. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time. This time, I did not think it was cool. I watched them quietly, trying to understand why they were there. There was no obvious food. There was no trash. There was nothing I could see that would explain why so many birds were gathered around one burned house while ignoring every other place on the block. Maybe there was something in the debris. Maybe the smell of smoke, ash, or damaged wood attracted them. Maybe there was food or garbage left inside the property that people could not see from the sidewalk. Maybe a group of crows had simply found a place they liked to gather. That could be true. Birds do strange things sometimes, and crows are known to gather in large numbers. They are intelligent. They notice changes in their environment. They investigate things. They return to places that interest them. There may have been an entirely normal reason for it, but when I looked at that house, covered in black birds after it burned down, I could not make myself believe it was random. The timing was too strange. The birds appeared when the cars disappeared. They covered the house before the fire. They returned after the fire, when nobody knew what had happened to the people who lived there. And then, after that day, I never saw them gathered there like that again. Not in the same way. Not hundreds of them. Not covering the roof and yard. The burned house remained for a while. Eventually, things changed. The property was dealt with in whatever way properties like that get dealt with. People moved on. New stories replaced the old one. The neighborhood found other things to talk about. But I never forgot the crows. People usually laugh when I tell them about it. They say crows are just birds. They say there was probably food or something dead in the yard. They say the birds had nothing to do with the fire. And maybe they are right. I do not claim the crows caused anything. I do not claim they knew the house was going to burn. I do not claim they were a warning, a sign, or anything supernatural. But I know what I saw. I saw a house that was usually full of cars suddenly sitting empty. I saw more crows than I had ever seen in one place gathered around that one property. I saw that house burn down the next morning. I heard that no one could explain what happened to the people who lived there or where the fire began. Then I saw the crows return to the ruins. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was nature doing something I did not understand. Maybe there was a practical answer that never reached me. But whenever I think back to that house, I do not picture the fire first. I picture the roof covered in crows. I picture them sitting silently above the empty driveway. And I picture them coming back after the fire, as if they had been waiting for something the rest of us never saw. One day, around lunchtime, I was in my bedroom playing video games. I was sitting on the corner of my bed with my back to the door, completely focused on the screen. My boyfriend and my friend were both in the kitchen at the time. I could hear them talking now and then, with the usual sounds of people making food and moving things around in the other room. It was an ordinary day. Nothing felt strange before it happened. The sun was out, the house was bright, and I was not alone. That matters to me because it was not the middle of the night, and I was not half asleep. I was awake, focused on my game and fully aware of where everyone was. My room was quiet except for the sound of the game. I was sitting near the edge of the mattress, leaning slightly forward, controller in my hands. The bed was behind me. I knew no one had come into the room because I had not heard the door open, but I was paying more attention to the game than anything else around me. Then I felt someone sit down on the bed behind me. It was unmistakable. Anyone who has sat on a bed knows the feeling. The mattress lowers suddenly on one side. The frame gives a little. The surface shifts under your weight, even if the person sits gently. It is not something you confuse with a blanket moving or the house settling. The bed dipped behind me. At first I assumed it was my boyfriend or my friend. That was the most normal explanation. They were both in the house. One of them probably came in quietly, sat down behind me, and was watching me play. I did not turn around because I was in the middle of something on the screen. Instead, I just started talking. I said something about the game, probably complaining about a level or explaining what I was doing. I spoke casually, the way you do when someone has joined you in a room and you expect them to be listening. There was no answer. I kept playing. The weight stayed on the bed. I could still feel the mattress pressed down behind me. It was not a brief shift. It was not like someone had leaned against the edge and then walked away. Whoever I thought was there seemed to be sitting completely still. I talked for maybe a minute. I do not remember exactly what I said. It was probably nothing important. I was just speaking out loud about the game, waiting for some kind of response, a laugh, a comment, anything. Nothing came back. At first, that did not scare me. I thought maybe they were distracted. Maybe they were looking at their phone. Maybe they had come in to grab something and sat down for a second. Maybe they were tired and did not feel like talking. But after a while, the silence started to bother me. The person behind me had not moved. They had not spoken. They had not breathed loudly. They had not shifted their weight. They were just there. Or at least, the weight was there. Finally, I said something like, "Hey, pay attention." I said it while turning around, expecting to see one of them sitting behind me. There was nobody there. The bed was empty. The moment I looked, the weight disappeared. The mattress lifted back into place beneath me as though no one had ever sat down. For a second, I just froze. I remember staring at the empty space behind me, trying to understand what I had felt. My eyes moved around the room. I looked toward the door. I looked under the bed without really meaning to. I looked at the closet. I checked the corners as if someone could somehow be hiding in plain sight. There was nobody. The bedroom door was still the way it had been. Nothing was out of place. No one had slipped out while I was turning around. There was not enough time for that. The room was not big, and there was nowhere someone could have gone without me seeing them. But the bed had dipped. I knew it had. I could still feel the memory of the weight on the mattress, as clearly as if someone had just stood up. I sat there for a minute, trying to process it. Part of me wanted to laugh it off. I wanted to tell myself I had imagined it. Maybe I had shifted my own weight without noticing. Maybe the mattress springs moved strangely. Maybe the bed frame creaked and made the whole thing feel more real than it was. But I had been sitting still, and the feeling had lasted too long. It was not one small movement. It was a steady, clear pressure behind me while I played. Eventually, I got up and went to the kitchen. My boyfriend and friend were both there. They were exactly where I expected them to be. I asked them if either one had gone into my bedroom. They both said no. At first, they probably thought I was joking. Then I told them what happened. I explained that I had felt someone sit on my bed, that I had talked to them for at least a minute, and that when I turned around, nobody was there. Neither of them laughed. That was the first thing that made the experience feel worse. They believed me, not because they had seen anything that day, but because strange things had already happened in that house before I ever told them about the bed. We started talking about the other incidents. The house had always had a strange feeling in certain places, but we had not immediately called it haunted. People do not usually jump to that conclusion when they move somewhere new. Old houses make sounds. Doors shift. Pipes knock. Furniture creaks. You can blame a lot on drafts, loose hinges, tiredness, or simply being in an unfamiliar place. But there had been more than one thing, and the stories always seemed to circle back to one area in particular: the wardrobe in my bedroom. My boyfriend had seen something there before. One night, he woke up around 3:00 in the morning because of a noise. The sound had come from the bedroom. He was asleep at first, then suddenly awake in that sharp, confused way people wake up when something does not belong in the room. It was not a loud crash. It was not something that immediately told him what happened. It was just enough noise to pull him out of sleep. When he opened his eyes, he saw that the wardrobe door was open. The wardrobe was old and heavy. It was not one of those modern closets with sliding doors. It was a large freestanding piece of furniture, the kind with a proper door that opened outward. It stood against the wall near a corner of the room. He knew the door had been closed before he went to sleep. But now, it was open. At first, he may have assumed the latch had not caught correctly. Maybe the door had slowly opened on its own. Old furniture can do that. Wood changes with temperature. Hinges loosen. A door can shift with a slight movement of the house. But then he saw someone inside. An old man in a suit. The man was standing in the open wardrobe, just staring at us. That was all he did. He did not speak. He did not step out. He did not move toward the bed. He was simply there in the dark, dressed in a suit, watching. My boyfriend said the image was clear enough that he knew it was a man. Not a pile of clothes, not a coat hanging in the wardrobe, not a shadow that looked vaguely human. He saw the shape of an older man, dressed formally, standing in a place where no person could reasonably be standing. The room was dark, the house was quiet, and the wardrobe door was open. He did not know what to do. He stared at the man for a moment, trying to decide whether he was still dreaming. Then he blinked, looked again, and the man was gone. The wardrobe was empty. The door was still open. There was no one in the room. When he told me about it, I did not know what to think. I wanted to believe it had been part of a dream. Waking in the middle of the night can make things strange. Your eyes are not adjusted. you are half awake. Familiar objects can look wrong in the dark. But he was shaken by it. And he was not someone who normally made up ghost stories or exaggerated things for attention. Then my friend had an experience in the same house. She had been sleeping when she felt someone touch her shoulder. It was not a violent shake. It was more like a hand resting there, or someone lightly touching her to wake her up. At first, she thought it was one of us. That is a normal reaction. When people live together, it is common for someone to come into a room to ask a question, borrow something, or wake someone up. She probably assumed one of us needed her. She opened her eyes. A man in a suit was standing beside her bed, just staring at her. The room was dark enough that she could not see every detail, but she could see him clearly enough to know he was there. He was close to the bed, close enough that she could feel the panic hit before she fully understood what she was looking at. She quickly reached for the lamp on the nightstand. The moment she turned it on, the man was gone. There was no one beside the bed, no open door, no sound of someone leaving. Nothing, she told us about it later, and it matched too closely with what my boyfriend had described. An old man, a suit, standing silently, staring. Neither of them had heard the other person's story before having their own experience. They had not agreed on a description in advance. They were not trying to scare each other. But both of them described the same kind of figure. That was when we started wondering whether there was really something in the house. My mom had her own smaller experience when she came to visit. She did not say she saw a man. She did not say she saw a figure near the wardrobe. But she would sometimes wake up at night because she felt someone touch her feet. Not bump the bed, not pull a blanket, touch her feet. She described it as a brief feeling, like fingers brushing or pressing against them. Enough to wake her, enough that she would look around. But every time, there was nobody there. She did not make a huge deal out of it. She was more confused than anything else. She would mention it in the morning, then move on. But after hearing what my boyfriend and friend had seen, I could not help connecting it to everything else. Then there was the dog. Dogs notice things people do not always notice. At least, that is what people say. Maybe it is true. Maybe dogs hear sounds we cannot hear or smell things we cannot smell. Maybe they react to small movements, bugs inside walls, mice, pipes, electrical sounds, or scents that mean nothing to us. But our dog had a habit that made everyone uncomfortable. He would sit and stare at one corner of the wall beside the wardrobe. He did not do it once. He did it repeatedly. He would sit perfectly still, staring into that corner as if something was there. At first, we tried to see what he was looking at. Maybe there was a spider. Maybe a bug had crawled along the wall. Maybe there was a sound coming from inside the wardrobe or behind the baseboard. But there was never anything visible. The dog would just stare. Sometimes he would sit there for several minutes. Then, after enough time passed, he would start barking. Not barking at the door because he heard someone outside. Not barking at a noise from the street. He would bark while staring directly at that same corner beside the wardrobe. His body would become tense. His ears would stand up. His eyes would stay fixed in the same place. And he would bark at an empty wall. That made the room difficult to relax in. Once you hear enough stories about the same space, you cannot look at it normally anymore. Every time I entered my bedroom, I noticed the wardrobe. Every time it creaked, I looked toward the door. Every time the dog stared at the corner, I felt my stomach tighten. The wardrobe became more than furniture. It became the place where my boyfriend saw the man, the place beside the wall where the dog kept staring, the area that seemed connected to the old man in a suit. And now, after what happened to me, I started wondering whether the unseen thing that sat on my bed had been connected to it too. I did not see a man. I did not see anything at all. But I felt the weight of someone sitting behind me. I felt it long enough to talk to it, and it vanished the moment I turned around. For a while, strange things kept happening in the house, on and off. Not constantly. That might have been easier in some strange way. If something happened every day, you could point to a pattern. You could set up cameras. You could check locks. You could call someone to inspect the house. You could decide that something practical was causing it. But these things happened just rarely enough that they were hard to prove. A touch in the night. A wardrobe door open. A figure seen only for a moment. A dog barking at nothing. The pressure of someone sitting on a bed. Each thing alone could have an explanation. Maybe the wardrobe door had shifted open because of a bad hinge. Maybe my boyfriend had seen a nightmare image while waking up. Maybe my friend had been half asleep and mistaken a shadow for a person. Maybe my mom's feet touched a blanket, the edge of the mattress, or something else in the dark. Maybe the dog heard pipes or animals inside the wall. Maybe I had felt the bed shift because I moved, or because of the springs, or because I was so focused on the game that I misread what happened. All of those explanations are possible, but together they were hard to ignore, especially because different people had experiences at different times. No one had the exact same experience as anyone else, but enough of them pointed toward the same room, the same wardrobe, and the same feeling that something was quietly present in the house. We talked about moving furniture. We talked about getting rid of the wardrobe. We talked about whether we should ask the landlord if anyone had died in the house, or whether the furniture had belonged to someone before us. But we never did anything dramatic. No one called a priest. No one held a seance. No one tried to speak to whatever it might have been. We were scared, but we were also unsure. None of us wanted to make a bigger story out of something that might have had a normal explanation. So we lived around it. We closed the wardrobe door carefully. We left lights on sometimes. We paid attention when the dog stared into that corner. We told each other if anything else happened. Then, slowly, it stopped. Not after some big event. Not after a fight. Not after we changed something in the house. It just stopped. The dog stopped staring at the corner so often. The wardrobe door stayed closed. My mom stopped waking up feeling someone touch her feet. My boyfriend did not see the man again. My friend did not see him again. And I never felt someone sit on the bed behind me again. Years passed. I still live in the same house. That is what makes the ending strange to me. We did not move away. We did not leave the place behind. I still walk past the same rooms. I still remember where the wardrobe stood. I still know exactly which corner the dog used to stare at. But nothing has happened in years. The house feels normal now. Sometimes I wonder whether whatever was there simply left. Maybe it was connected to the wardrobe, and over time it faded away. Maybe it had been connected to a person who once lived there. Maybe it was never supernatural at all, and we were just a group of people who had a series of strange experiences in an old house. Maybe my boyfriend and friend had nighttime visions that happened to resemble each other. Maybe the dog was reacting to something hidden in the wall. Maybe I was distracted when I felt the bed shift. I cannot say for sure. But I know how it felt when I turned around and saw an empty bed. I know the look on my boyfriend's face when he described the old man in the wardrobe. I know how frightened my friend was when she said something touched her shoulder. And I know that every person in that house, in one way or another, seemed to notice something that did not belong. Then one day, it all went quiet. Nothing happened. And it has stayed quiet ever since. When I was 5 or 6 years old, my family went on a big camping trip in the desert. I was young enough that most of the trip has blended together in my memory over time. I remember the heat during the day, the dry ground, the smell of dust, the tents, and the way the sky looked once the sun went down. In the desert, there is a kind of darkness that feels different from darkness at home. There are fewer houses, fewer porch lights, fewer cars, and nothing nearby to make you feel like you are surrounded by people. At night, the land becomes huge. The stars look brighter because there is nothing competing with them. The horizon seems farther away. Even small sounds carry through the open space. You can hear tires on dirt, wind moving across dry brush, people talking near the campfire, and things shifting around in the dark that you cannot see. It was a family trip, so there were a lot of us there. My uncles, aunts, cousins, parents, and other relatives had all come out to camp together. During the day, the adults would sit around talking, cooking food, setting things up, or driving around the area. The kids would play nearby, get dirty, run around, and try to keep ourselves entertained. As a small child, I thought camping was exciting, but there were also parts of it that made me nervous. I did not like how far the dark seemed to reach beyond the camp. I did not like that there were no walls around us. At home, even if the outside was dark, you had doors, windows, rooms, lights, and other houses nearby. In the desert, the darkness was everywhere. You could look out in any direction and see nothing but empty land. Still, I was with my family, so I felt safe enough. At some point during the trip, one of my uncles invited everyone to go for a ride in his pickup truck. He was the type of person who thought driving fast over rough desert ground was funny. He was not trying to hurt anyone, but he definitely drove like an idiot when he had an audience. He liked the way people screamed when the truck bounced over bumps, swerved around corners, or threw dust up behind it. A few of us climbed into the back of the pickup. My aunt was there. Another uncle was there. I was there, along with a couple of other family members. I was little, so I remember being excited and scared at the same time. The back of the truck felt huge to me. Everyone was sitting or holding on as best they could, and the truck started moving away from the camp. At first, it was just fun. The truck bounced over the rough ground. Dust kicked up behind us. People laughed and shouted whenever my uncle hit a bump too hard or took a turn too fast. I remember gripping whatever I could hold on to, trying not to slide around while also laughing, because everyone else was laughing. The desert looked different from the back of the truck. The campfire and tents became smaller behind us. The lights from the campsite faded. Everything beyond the truck became dark and open. We were driving through a place where there were no street lights, no houses, and no obvious landmarks beyond rocky ground, low hills, brush, and whatever the headlights caught in front of us. My uncle was swerving around, driving too fast, and making the ride more intense than it needed to be. Then, I saw something. At first, I did not understand what I was looking at. It was off to one side of the truck, out in the open desert. I remember seeing two shapes above the ground. They were not standing on a hill. They were not on rocks. They were not sitting on anything that I could see. They were floating. They looked like two people. Both figures were fully dressed. I cannot remember the exact clothes they wore, and I do not want to pretend I can. I was 5 or 6, and it happened quickly. But I remember knowing they looked like people. They had human shapes. Heads, bodies, arms, legs. They were not animal shapes. They were not trees or bushes. And they were above the ground, maybe 20 feet in the air. That was what made the image impossible to understand. They were floating at a height that was high enough to be unmistakable. There was empty space beneath them. No ladder, no platform, no ridge, no tall object. They were just there in the darkness, suspended over the desert. They were also faintly illuminated, not brightly enough to light up the entire area around them, but enough that I could see them against the dark background. It was as though there was a soft light around them, or perhaps they were catching light from somewhere I could not see. They appeared to be facing each other, and they looked as if they were having a conversation. I could not hear what they were saying. I do not remember voices. I do not remember the sound of words coming through the air. But the way they were positioned made it look like they were talking to one another. One figure seemed turned slightly toward the other. Their heads were angled as if they were paying attention. It was not just two human-shaped things floating randomly in the sky. They looked occupied. They looked calm. They looked like they belonged there. I started screaming. I do not remember deciding to scream. I just did. The sight was so wrong that my body reacted before I had time to understand it. I was a little kid in the back of a bouncing truck, surrounded by family, and I was suddenly looking at two people floating in the air in the middle of the desert. At the same time I began screaming, my aunt screamed too. That is one of the strongest parts of the memory. I was not the only one who saw them. She saw something too. Her scream came almost at the exact same moment as mine. It was not the kind of scream you make because the truck hits a bump. We had already been laughing and shouting from the rough ride. This was different. It was sharp and frightened. My uncle slammed on the brakes. The truck stopped hard enough that everyone lurched forward. Dust rose around us. People started asking what was wrong. Everyone was talking at once. What happened? Did somebody get hurt? Why were we screaming? What did we see? I remember trying to point, but I was too scared and too young to explain it properly. My aunt was also upset. We both kept saying there were people, or something like that. We tried to tell everyone that there were two figures floating in the air. The others looked, but by then, there was nothing there. The desert was dark again. The space where I had seen them was empty. No lights, no people, no shapes, no sign that anything had been floating above the ground. That made it worse. If the figures had stayed there, maybe the adults could have seen them. Maybe somebody would have explained what they were. Maybe there would have been a normal answer. But they were gone by the time the truck stopped, and everyone looked. The people with us probably assumed we had mistaken something in the dark for people. Maybe they thought we saw reflections from the truck lights. Maybe they thought we saw dust, brush, or rocks at a strange angle. Maybe they thought the rough ride had scared us and our minds had made something out of the darkness. I do not know what everyone else believed. But I remember my aunt's reaction. She had been an adult. She had been sitting in the truck with me, and she screamed at the same time I did. That mattered to me, even as a child. I was too young to fully understand what floating figures meant. I knew it was wrong. I knew it was frightening. But having my aunt react too told me I was not simply imagining something alone. Eventually, the truck started moving again. I do not remember whether we turned around and went back to camp or kept driving for a while. I only remember being afraid after that. The desert no longer felt exciting. The darkness outside the truck no longer seemed like an empty place full of rocks and sand. It felt occupied. I kept looking out into the night, expecting to see the figures again. I thought I might see them above a ridge. I thought I might see their faint light hovering over the ground, somewhere farther away. But I did not. The rest of the ride became a blur. Maybe the adults talked about it. Maybe they told us it was nothing. Maybe they tried to calm me down. I do not remember. I only remember that image stayed with me. Two fully dressed figures, floating in the dark desert air, facing each other as if they were having a normal conversation. That was one of the first things that made nighttime feel unsafe to me. The second incident happened at home. I was sleeping in my mom's room one night. I do not remember exactly why I was sleeping with her. Maybe I had a bad dream. Maybe I was sick. Maybe I was scared after something else. When you are a small kid, there are many reasons you end up in your parents' bed, and sometimes you do not remember the reason later. But I remember the room. My mom had left the bedroom door open. The hallway outside was dark, but not completely black. There was enough light coming from somewhere in the house that I could see the shape of the hallway, the doorway, and movement if someone walked past. We were lying in bed. The house was quiet. Then we saw my brother walk down the hallway. It was not a vague shadow. It was not a sound that made us assume he was there. We both saw him. He walked past the open bedroom door in a way that looked completely normal. He looked like my brother. He moved like my brother. It was the kind of simple moment that would not have meant anything if he had actually been home. But he was not supposed to be there. At first, my mom and I assumed he had come back. Maybe he had returned early. Maybe someone had brought him home. Maybe plans had changed and nobody had told us yet. It was dark, we had been lying down, and we had no reason to think it was impossible. I remember getting up and going to look for him. I expected to find him in his room. I expected to hear him in the kitchen. I expected to see him standing somewhere in the house. But he was not there. The hallway was empty. His room was empty. The rest of the house was quiet. We checked again. There was no sign of him. Then we found out that he was still out of town. He had not come home early. He had not been dropped off. He was not supposed to return for another couple of days. That was when the normal explanation disappeared. My mom had seen him too. She had been lying in bed with me. We both watched him walk through the hallway. We both assumed it was him. And we both went looking for him afterward. But he was not there. I remember feeling afraid in a different way than I had felt in the desert. The desert incident was sudden and huge. It was outside, in a place where everything was dark and unfamiliar. It was terrifying, because I saw something impossible in the open air. This was worse in a quieter way. This happened inside our home. It happened in a hallway I knew. It happened at night while I was in bed with my mom, in a place where I should have felt completely safe. And it looked like someone I loved. That was what stayed with me. It was not some strange monster or unknown figure. It was my brother, or something that looked exactly like him, walking through the house as though he belonged there. Afterward, I could not stop thinking about it. I wondered whether he had somehow come home and left again before I got to the hallway. But that made no sense. There was nowhere for him to go without being seen. He had been out of town. He had not returned. Nobody had brought him back, and my mom was certain he was not supposed to be home for days. Maybe we saw a shadow that looked like him. Maybe the light from another room made a shape in the hallway. Maybe we were tired and our minds filled in the details because we expected my brother to be around. Those are possible explanations. But it did not feel like a shadow. We both saw him walking. We both recognized him. And we both reacted as if he had actually returned. After those experiences, I became scared of the dark for a long time. I had other strange memories too, things I could not fully explain. Small moments that did not fit neatly into normal life. But those two incidents were the ones that stayed with me most clearly. The two floating people in the desert. My brother walking through the hallway when he was nowhere near the house. Those were the reasons I slept with a nightlight until I was 23. People sometimes laugh when they hear that. They think of nightlights as something only little children need. But for me, it was not about being afraid of monsters under the bed in the usual childhood way. It was about what I had seen. It was about knowing that things could appear in the dark and look real. It was about waking up in a safe room and seeing someone who should not be there. It was about looking out into the open desert and seeing two illuminated figures floating 20 feet above the ground. I tried to grow out of it. As I got older, I would tell myself that I was being irrational. I would tell myself that the desert was dark, that headlights and dust could create strange images, that a child's memory is not always reliable, and that my aunt might have screamed for some other reason at the exact same time. I would tell myself that my mom and I could have mistaken a shadow for my brother in the hallway. I would tell myself that sleep, fear, and memory can all make ordinary things feel more frightening than they really are. And maybe all of that is true. Maybe there are explanations I have never found. Maybe the desert figures were something physical that looked strange because we saw them from a moving truck at night. Maybe the person in the hallway was not really my brother, even though that is exactly how it appeared to both of us. Maybe the stories changed slightly in my memory as the years passed, but there is a difference between questioning an experience and forgetting it. I have questioned these things many times. I have tried to make them normal. I have tried to explain them away. But I have never been able to erase how real they felt in the moment. When I think about the desert, I still see the open darkness beyond the truck. I still see the two figures suspended in the air, faintly illuminated and facing one another. I still remember screaming and hearing my aunt scream at the same time. When I think about the hallway, I still remember seeing my brother walk by the open bedroom door. I still remember getting up to look for him. I still remember realizing he was not home and would not be home for days. Those memories stayed with me. And for a very long time, when the lights went out at night, I needed at least one small light to stay on. Not because I thought it would stop anything, but because I did not want to be left alone with the dark.
Quick pause, then we're right back. A lot of people watch one story and leave, but some stick around. They hit subscribe and come back every night. If you want to be one of them, the button's right there. Turn on the bell too, so you never miss a new one. That's it. Let's get back to the story.
My dad and I used to go hiking in the woods a lot. We lived in a rural part of New York, so walking through the woods was not unusual for us. There were trails, old logging paths, hunting land, stretches of trees that seemed to go on forever, and plenty of places where you could walk for a long time without seeing another person. The woods were familiar to us. They were not some distant wilderness we had traveled to for a weekend. They were part of everyday life. We knew the sounds of birds, the way the ground changed under different types of trees, the smell of wet leaves after rain, and the difference between a path that had been used recently and one that had not been touched in years. There were places we avoided because the ground got too muddy. There were places we knew were full of thorns. There were old trails that were easier to follow in the fall because the leaves had dropped, and others that almost disappeared in summer when everything grew in thick. We also knew that people had camps scattered throughout the woods. That was normal where we lived. Sometimes you would come across a small cabin, an old camper, or a rough little hunting camp tucked deep into the trees. A lot of them were used only during hunting season. The owners would show up for a few days or a week, maybe keep some supplies there, then leave the place sitting empty for most of the year. Some were in decent shape. Others looked like they had been abandoned for decades. You might see a weathered trailer with broken windows, a small wooden shack leaning slightly to one side, a rusted barrel, a stack of firewood that had gone soft and gray with age, an old chair sitting under a tree, half buried in leaves. Hunting camps had their own strange feeling, especially when you found one with nobody around, but they were common enough that neither my dad nor I thought much of them. Not at first. One day we were out hiking like usual. I do not remember the exact season, but I remember enough to know that the woods were open enough for us to move through without too much trouble. We had gotten pretty far from the house, maybe around a mile out. That might not sound like much to someone who hikes in parks or follows marked trails, but in that part of the woods, a mile was a lot. There were no sidewalks, no clear signs, no cell service you could count on, no guarantee that somebody would hear you if you yelled. A mile through rural woods can feel much farther than a mile along a road. You have to go around fallen trees, through brush, over uneven ground, across wet patches, and around places where the forest floor drops unexpectedly. We were not lost. At least, I do not think we were. My dad knew the area well enough, and we had gone far from the house before. We were just exploring, walking where the trees opened up enough to make it easy, following whatever route seemed interesting. The woods were quiet that day, not completely silent. Woods are never truly silent. There were birds somewhere in the distance. Leaves moved above us. Branches cracked under our boots. The wind made a soft sound through the trees now and then, but there was no sign of other people. No voices, no distant engines, no gunshots, no smoke. Nothing that suggested someone else was nearby. We had been walking for a while when we came across a campsite. At first, it looked normal. We saw the shape of a small structure through the trees. It might have been a camper, a cabin, or some kind of hunting shelter. It was hard to tell from a distance because of the brush, but it had that familiar look. Something temporary or old sitting in the middle of the woods. I remember thinking it was probably another hunting camp. We had seen plenty of them. You would usually notice a small clearing around them, maybe a fire pit, maybe an old cooler, maybe a pile of cut wood. The ground would be trampled down from people walking around. There might be tire tracks if there was a rough road nearby, or a narrow path leading away from the structure. That was what I expected. But the closer we got, the stranger it looked. The first thing I noticed was the ground. The forest floor had been swept clean. Not cleared with a rake, not trampled down. Swept, it looked as though someone had taken an actual broom and carefully brushed away everything that naturally belonged there. All the dead leaves, all the pine needles, all the small sticks, all the loose bark, all the little bits of forest debris that normally cover the ground. Gone, the dirt beneath was exposed in a huge circle around the camp. At first, I could not understand what I was seeing. You do not expect to find bare, swept earth in the middle of the woods. A normal campsite might have a small, cleared space near a fire pit. Someone might rake leaves away from a tent or camper because they do not want dry debris catching fire. But this was not a small area. This was enormous. The cleared ground stretched out around the campsite for what looked like 75 feet in every direction. Maybe that estimate was not exact, but it was huge. Way too big to be practical. It was not just a little patch around the door. It was not just the ground near a fire. It was a massive circle of bare dirt surrounding the entire camp. Everything that had been removed from the clearing had been pushed outward. The leaves, sticks, pine needles, and debris formed a ring around the edge of the swept area. It was like someone had drawn a boundary in the forest. Inside the boundary was clean dirt. Outside it was normal woods. The contrast was what made it unsettling. One step, you were standing in a forest where the ground was covered in leaves and twigs. Then suddenly there was this huge open patch where the earth had been scrubbed bare. No natural mess, no clutter, no soft layer of leaves under your boots. Just dirt, flat, exposed, carefully swept dirt. I stopped walking. My dad stopped too. Neither of us said anything right away. We were both staring at it. I remember looking toward the structure itself, trying to see whether there was some obvious reason for the clearing. Maybe there had been a fire. Maybe the owner was preparing the area for something. Maybe it was a hunting camp where people were extremely careful about clearing brush. But nothing about it felt normal. It did not look practical. It did not look like somebody clearing a safe zone around a campfire. It looked deliberate in a way that made no sense. The area was too large. The debris ring was too even. The ground looked too carefully maintained. And the whole thing sat deep enough in the woods that it felt disconnected from anything normal. No one was outside. No truck was parked nearby. No lights were on. No smoke came from the campsite. No dog barked. No one called out. There was nothing that told us the place was occupied. But it did not feel abandoned either. That was the worst part. Old hunting camps usually look neglected. Their yards are overgrown. Leaves pile up around the walls. Trees start creeping closer. Branches fall across paths. Everything looks like nature has slowly taken the place back. This camp looked cared for. Not in a normal way. Not with flowers or chairs or a clean porch, but with that huge bare circle of dirt. It looked like somebody had spent a lot of time making sure the forest did not touch the space around the structure. I remember feeling a cold, uneasy sensation in my stomach. The first thing that came to mind was that it looked like something from a horror movie. Not in a supernatural way, exactly. More like the kind of setting where you know you are somewhere you should not be. The kind of place where the people who live there do not want visitors. The kind of place where you might hear a door open behind you and realize that leaving quietly would have been the better choice. My dad and I looked at each other. We did not need to say much. I do not remember the exact words, but I remember how quiet we were. We spoke in low voices. Maybe one of us said something like, "What the hell is that?" Maybe we wondered why anyone would sweep such a huge area. Maybe we just exchanged the look that means we should not be here. My dad was not someone who got scared easily. He had grown up around rural places. He knew hunting camps, old cabins, strange people, and the general reality of living near woods where you did not always know who owned which patch of land. He was not the kind of person who would panic because a place looked a little odd, but he did not like it either. I could tell. He kept looking at the clearing. Then he looked back the way we had come. Then he looked toward the cabin again. He was trying to figure out whether there was a reasonable explanation, but I do not think he found one. Neither did I. We did not walk closer. We did not call out. We did not try to inspect the structure. We did not step into the cleared circle. We turned around and started walking back. Fast, not running, but fast enough that it was obvious we both wanted distance between ourselves and that place. At first, neither of us spoke much. We just moved. The woods suddenly felt different. Before we found the camp, it had been a familiar place. We were hiking, talking, walking through trees we had seen before. Afterward, every sound seemed louder. A branch snapping behind us made me look back. Leaves shifting in the wind made me wonder whether someone was moving through the trees. Every dark patch between trunks looked like it could hide a person. I kept expecting to hear someone call out from the direction of the camp. I expected a dog to start barking. I expected footsteps. Nothing happened. We kept walking. The farther away we got, the more I tried to tell myself there had to be a reasonable reason for it. Maybe the person who owned the camp had a severe fear of ticks or snakes and kept the ground clear. Maybe they were trying to prevent fires. Maybe it was a hunting practice I did not understand. Maybe the owner wanted to keep a clean area so animals could not sneak up near the cabin. Maybe there had been some kind of event there, and someone was clearing the ground for practical reasons. But every explanation felt weak. Why 75 feet? Why sweep every bit of natural forest debris into such a clean ring? Why do it around a hidden camp deep in the woods? Why make the clearing look so much like a boundary? Maybe there was an answer. Maybe someone who hunts or camps regularly would look at it and know exactly what it was for. But neither my dad nor I had ever seen anything like it. By the time we got closer to home, we were both talking more openly about it. My dad finally said what I had been thinking. He said, "That was some serial killer shit." That was his exact phrase. And honestly, it was the only way either of us could describe the feeling. It did not mean we actually believed there was a serial killer living there. We had no proof of anything like that. Nobody had chased us. Nobody had threatened us. We did not see weapons, blood, traps, or anything that would clearly point to a crime. But the place gave off that feeling. It looked staged, too controlled, too isolated, too unnatural. Like someone had created a space in the woods that had rules we did not understand. My dad agreed that we should not go back. I agreed immediately. Neither of us had any interest in seeing it again. We never went back there. Not once. There are plenty of places in the woods that we returned to over the years. Trails we liked. Areas where we found interesting trees, old remnants of camps, streams, clearings, or deer paths. We kept hiking. We kept going into the woods. But not that direction. We avoided that part of the forest completely. If we were walking near the general area, we would turn another way. If a trail seemed to head toward it, we would take a different route. It became one of those places you do not need to see twice. I sometimes wondered what the camp looked like from closer up. Was it a cabin? A camper? A shack? Was anyone actually living there? Was the clearing part of some bizarre hunting method? Was there a practical reason for the swept dirt that would have made total sense if we had known the owner? Maybe the person had obsessive habits. Maybe they had a fire safety reason. Maybe they were clearing the area for building work. Maybe it was connected to some kind of survivalist setup. But I never wanted to find out. That is the thing about certain places. You do not always need proof that something bad is happening to know you do not want to stay there. Sometimes a place just feels wrong. Not because of ghosts. Not because you heard a voice in the dark. Not because anything jumped out at you. Sometimes it is the opposite. Sometimes it is wrong because it is too quiet, too clean, too carefully arranged. The forest is supposed to look like a forest. Leaves should cover the ground. Sticks should lie where they fall. The earth should not be exposed in a perfect wide circle around an isolated campsite unless there is a reason. And if you do not know the reason, it is hard not to imagine the worst. Years later, I can still picture it. The trees all around, the small structure sitting in the center, the wide circle of bare dirt, the ring of leaves and debris pushed outward like a boundary. No people, no vehicles, no explanation. Just a clearing that felt like it had been prepared for something. I do not know what the owner was doing there. I do not know whether the camp was abandoned or occupied. I do not know whether there was anything criminal, supernatural, or dangerous about it. Maybe it was completely harmless. Maybe the person who owned it would have laughed if they knew two hikers saw their clearing and assumed the worst. But my dad and I both felt the same thing. We both saw it. We both immediately wanted to leave. And neither of us has ever gone back. Even now, when I think about hiking in those woods, I remember that place more clearly than almost anything else. Not because something happened there, but because nothing did. We saw something that looked wrong. We felt the danger of not understanding it. and we turned around before we found out why someone had swept the forest clean. When I was 17, my brother had recently adopted a beagle, and I lived in a really shady neighborhood in a town that was still trying to get on its feet. It was not the kind of place where people felt completely safe walking around at night. Crime rates were high. People kept their doors locked. You learned not to leave things outside, not to walk alone too late, and not to assume that every car slowly driving down the street had a harmless reason for being there. There were plenty of good people in the neighborhood, of course. Families lived there. Kids played outside during the day. People went to work, ran errands, walked dogs, and tried to live normal lives. But there was always an edge to the area. You heard about break-ins, fights, stolen cars, and things happening a few blocks away that made you more careful than you might have been somewhere else. Even as a teenager, I knew that being alert mattered. My brother had recently adopted a beagle. The dog was still getting used to the house, the neighborhood, and everyone around him. He was friendly, but he had that nervous, curious energy beagles are known for. His nose was always working. He noticed every smell, every sound, every movement in the grass or on the sidewalk. He had not been with us very long, but he had already become part of the family. During Christmas break, my brother needed someone to look after him for a while. I do not remember exactly where my brother was going, only that he asked me to take care of the dog while he was away. I agreed. It did not seem like a difficult job. Feed him, make sure he had water, take him outside, and walk him enough that he got exercise. I was 17, awkward, and probably more bored than I wanted to admit during break, so having the dog around was nice. The first day I watched him, everything started normally. I took him outside so he could do his business, then decided to walk him down the road. The weather was cold enough that the streets were quiet. There were fewer people outside than usual, and most houses looked shut down for the holidays. The dog was on his leash, sniffing everything. He stopped at trees, curb edges, driveways, patches of grass, and any place another dog might have been. I was not in a hurry. I just wanted him to get some exercise and settle down. We had gone about halfway down the road when I noticed a black four-wheeler parked along the side. At first, I ignored it. For that neighborhood, it was not especially unusual to see strange vehicles parked around. People had trucks, motorcycles, old cars, four-wheelers, and all kinds of things sitting near the curb. The vehicle did not immediately stand out enough for me to think there was a problem. It was dark-colored, almost completely black from what I remember, and it was parked quietly along the road. But the dog noticed it. The moment we got closer, he began whimpering, not barking in excitement, not pulling because he wanted to sniff something. Whimpering, then he started trying to turn around. At first, I thought he was just being stubborn. Dogs do that sometimes. They decide they do not want to go one direction, and suddenly the leash becomes a tug of war. I encouraged him to keep walking. I gave the leash a gentle pull and tried to lead him forward. He would not go. He planted himself. Then he pulled harder in the opposite direction. His body was low, tense, and angled away from the four-wheeler. He kept looking back toward the direction we had come from, then toward me, then away from the parked vehicle. The farther I tried to guide him forward, the more determined he became to go back. That was when I started paying more attention. I looked at the four-wheeler again. Nothing obvious happened. I did not see anyone step out. I did not hear anyone speak. I did not see a weapon or anything that clearly told me I was in danger. But the dog was not acting normal. He was scared. Maybe he smelled another animal. Maybe there was something leaking from the vehicle. Maybe he heard something I could not hear. Maybe he simply did not like the sound or smell coming from that side of the road. But I had only known him for a short time, and even I could tell this was different from ordinary stubbornness. So I listened to him. Instead of continuing the route I had planned, I turned around. The dog immediately started moving again. He did not hesitate. The moment we faced away from the four-wheeler, he walked quickly, pulling me toward home. He still looked uneasy, but at least he was willing to go. I remember feeling a little foolish for being nervous. It was just a vehicle. It was just a dog refusing to walk past something. Maybe I was letting the neighborhood get into my head. Maybe I had been raised to assume something bad was happening whenever I saw something unfamiliar. I told myself that I was overthinking it. Still, I kept checking behind me as we walked home. When we got back, I brought the dog inside and tried to forget about it. But not long after that, I noticed the vehicle again. This time, it drove slowly past the house. I caught only a glimpse through the window. I saw the dark vehicle move down the street at a speed that felt too slow for someone simply passing through. Then there was a flash. It was quick, bright enough that I noticed it immediately, but too quick for me to understand where it came from. Then the vehicle sped off. At first, I thought it might have been a reflection. Maybe sunlight hit something. Though it was winter and the light was low, maybe it was a camera flash. Maybe it was someone's phone. Maybe a piece of metal reflected light through the windshield. I did not know. But the way the vehicle slowed down near the house made me uneasy. I mentioned it to myself only in the quiet way you do when you are trying not to make a big deal out of something. That was weird. Then I moved on. Over the next several weeks, it happened again and again. The same dark vehicle would drive slowly past the house. Sometimes I would notice it from the window. Sometimes I would hear it first and look outside. Sometimes I was already watching because I had started becoming more aware of cars that moved slowly down the street. Each time it seemed to follow the same pattern. The vehicle would pass slowly. There would be a flash. Then it would speed away. I never got a good look at the driver at first. I never knew whether it was the same person every time, though the vehicle looked the same. I did not know whether the flash was a camera, a phone, a light, or something else, but it happened enough that I stopped thinking it was random. I started closing the curtains more often. I started checking the locks. I started feeling uneasy whenever I took the beagle outside. The dog did not always react when the vehicle passed, but sometimes he would become alert. He would stop sniffing and stare down the road. His ears would lift. His body would stiffen slightly, as if he recognized a sound or scent before I did. That made me trust my first reaction more. I thought about the first walk. I thought about how he had refused to go past that parked four-wheeler. I thought about how quickly he had wanted to turn around. I wondered whether he had sensed people inside it. I wondered whether someone had been watching us. Maybe that was not true. Maybe I was connecting things that had nothing to do with each other. But once you see the same vehicle repeatedly circling near your house, it becomes difficult not to wonder why. I was only 17. I did not know what to do at first. Part of me did not want to tell anyone because I worried they would think I was being dramatic. There was no clear threat. Nobody had approached me. Nobody had said anything. Nobody had tried to get into the house. All I had was a dark vehicle, repeated slow drive-bys, and brief flashes. But it did not feel right. And in a neighborhood where people already knew to be cautious, that was enough. Eventually, I reported it to the police. I explained what I could. I told them there had been a dark four-wheeler or vehicle parked down the road when I was walking the dog. I told them the dog had become frightened and refused to go near it. I told them that afterward, a similar vehicle had slowly driven past my house several times. I told them about the flashes. I did not know what they were. I did not claim I knew for certain. I only said that each time the vehicle passed slowly, I saw a sudden flash. Then it would speed away. The police took the report seriously enough to send a patrol car. I remember feeling nervous while waiting. Part of me thought nothing would happen. Maybe the officer would drive around, see nothing unusual, and leave. Maybe I would feel embarrassed. Maybe I would have to accept that I had worked myself up over something ordinary. But the patrol car had barely been around long before they found the vehicle. It was parked just down the street, closer to my house than before. That was the moment when my stomach dropped. The vehicle had been there. It was real. It had not been some random thing I imagined or confused with another car. The police found it nearby, parked close enough that it made me wonder how long it had been sitting there and whether the people inside had been watching the house. The officers approached it. From what I remember, there was a man and a woman in the vehicle. They were arrested. I never found out exactly what happened after that. I did not hear whether they had been charged with anything serious. I did not hear why they had been parked there. I did not hear what the flashes were. I did not hear whether the police found anything in the vehicle or whether there was some explanation for why it kept driving slowly past the house. After the arrest, the vehicle stopped appearing. That was all I knew. No more slow drive-bys, no more flashes, no more dark vehicle parked down the road, no more strange feeling whenever I took the dog outside. The beagle eventually relaxed too. For a while, I kept expecting the vehicle to return. I kept looking out windows when I heard an engine slow down. I kept checking the street before taking the dog for a walk. But it never came back. I have thought about that first day many times. Maybe the dog simply did not like the four-wheeler. Maybe he smelled something strange. Maybe he heard the people inside. Maybe there was nothing dangerous about it at all, and I only became worried because of the neighborhood we lived in. But then there were the repeated drive-bys, the flashes, the police finding the vehicle parked close to my house, the fact that there were two people inside and that both of them were arrested. I do not know what they wanted. I do not know whether they were watching the house, watching me, or doing something completely unrelated that happened to look suspicious. I do not know whether the flash was a camera. Maybe it was. Maybe they were taking pictures of houses, cars, windows, or something else. Maybe they were photographing the street for reasons I never learned. Maybe it was not a camera at all. But as a 17-year-old, it felt like I was being watched. And that was enough to scare me. People sometimes say stories are not scary unless they involve ghosts, monsters, or something supernatural. But honestly, this was scarier because it could have been real. There was no shadow creature to explain away, no strange voice in the night, no haunted house. There was a real vehicle. There were real people inside it. And there was a real possibility that something bad could have happened if I had kept walking toward it that first day. Maybe nothing would have happened. Maybe I would have walked past, and the people inside would have ignored me. Maybe they were harmless, but I will never know. What I do know is that the beagle did not want to go near them. He pulled me back toward home. And I listened. I still think about that sometimes. I was awkward, 17, and just trying to walk my brother's new dog during Christmas break. I did not think I was in danger. I did not think anything important was going to happen. Then, a scared beagle refused to walk past a dark vehicle. If I had forced him forward, I do not know what might have happened. Maybe the answer is nothing. Maybe it would have been an ordinary day. But after the vehicle kept returning, after the flashes, after the police found it close to my house and arrested the people inside, I stopped believing it was just a coincidence. The dog may have understood something before I did, and I am glad I listened to him. This is probably going to get buried, but last year my fiancé and I started to believe that the house we were living in was haunted. At first, neither of us wanted to call it that. Even when weird things happened, we tried to find ordinary explanations. Old houses make noise. Basements settle. Pipes knock inside walls. Shadows look strange in the corner of your eye, especially when you are tired. We were both adults. We had a baby to care for, and we did not want to make ourselves more afraid by deciding every creak or movement meant something supernatural. But eventually, there were too many things. Not one big dramatic event that gave us proof, just one strange thing after another. Small moments that did not seem like much by themselves, but became harder to ignore when they kept happening in the same house. Our bedroom was in the finished basement. It was not a rough, unfinished basement with bare cement walls and exposed pipes. It had been made into a living space. There were finished walls, flooring, a bedroom area, and enough room that it felt usable. Still, it was underground. No matter how much a basement is renovated, there is always something different about sleeping below the rest of the house. The air feels heavier. The ceiling feels lower. You know there are rooms above you, but you cannot see what is happening in them. At night, when the rest of the house is quiet, every sound carries differently down there. You hear pipes. You hear the structure settling. You hear the muffled movement of the house above you. And sometimes you hear things that do not make sense. Before our daughter was born, we had already noticed shadows in the hallway. They were never clear enough that we could say we saw a person standing there. It was more like catching movement at the edge of your vision. A dark shape would pass through the hall, quick enough that by the time you turned to look, there was nothing there. At first, I blamed the lighting. The hallway had places where the light did not reach evenly. A door opening or closing somewhere else could change the shadows. Headlights from a car outside could reflect through a window. Someone could walk past a room, and the movement would catch your eye in a way that made you think you saw more than you did. But the shadows kept happening. Sometimes I would be in the basement and see something black move down the hall toward the stairs. Other times, my fiancé would mention seeing the same kind of thing. Neither of us wanted to say much about it at first. Saying it out loud made it feel more serious. If you tell someone I keep seeing a shadow figure move through the hall, you hear how strange it sounds. You begin to question yourself before anyone else gets the chance to. So we mostly dismissed it. We would say it was probably the lighting. We would say we were tired. We would say it was nothing. Then there were the footsteps. Because our room was in the finished basement, we could hear the floor above us. That part was normal. If someone was upstairs, we could hear them move. A person walking through the kitchen or living room could make the ceiling creak. If the house shifted at night, it could sound like a step. But there were times when we heard clear footsteps above us, while nobody was supposed to be there. We would be downstairs together, and the sound would come from overhead. Slow steps, not the settling sound of old wood, not a single pop from a pipe. Actual footsteps moving across the floor. One step, then another, then another. Sometimes they seemed to cross the room above our bedroom. Sometimes they stopped directly over us. We would both look up at the ceiling, waiting for another sound, and there would be nothing. The house would go quiet again. We would ask each other if one of us had heard it. Usually the answer was yes. That was what made it difficult to ignore. I was not always alone when something happened. My fiancé heard things too. He saw the hallway shadows too. We were both trying to be reasonable. But it is hard to stay reasonable when two people keep having the same reaction to the same strange events. Then our daughter was born. After that, everything seemed to get worse. I do not know whether it really did get worse, or whether we were simply more tired, more alert, and more sensitive because we had a newborn in the house. Sleep deprivation can do strange things to you. You are awake at odd hours, listening for every small sound. You are constantly checking whether the baby is breathing, comfortable, warm enough, safe enough. But whatever the reason, the house felt different after she arrived. The shadows seemed more frequent. The footsteps seemed louder. The basement no longer felt like a place where we could relax. One day, I was downstairs breastfeeding my daughter. It was a normal moment, at least at first. I was sitting with her, focused on keeping her comfortable and calm. The room was quiet. My fiancé was not right beside me at that moment, and I remember feeling tired in the way new parents are tired, but not asleep or dreaming. There was a small bag of diapers sitting on top of a dresser. It had been placed there in a stable way. It was not hanging off the edge. It was not balanced precariously. It was sitting flat enough that nobody would expect it to move unless someone touched it. Then it flipped off the dresser. Not slid, not tipped slowly. Flipped, the bag seemed to lift and turn as if something had struck the top of it. Then it hit the floor. The sound made me jump. For a second, I just stared at it. I tried to understand what I had seen. Maybe it had been sitting closer to the edge than I realized. Maybe the dresser was uneven. Maybe something vibrated. Maybe the bag had shifted slowly and I had only noticed at the last second. But the way it moved did not look like gravity. It looked like it had been hit, like someone had slapped or pushed down on the top of it hard enough to make it flip forward and fall. I looked around the room immediately. There was nobody there. My daughter was in my arms. The door was closed, or at least not showing anyone standing near it. Nothing else had moved. But after the bag hit the floor, the room changed. That is difficult to explain without sounding dramatic, but it is the only way I know how to describe it. The air felt heavy. Not physically heavy, like there was smoke or humidity. It was more like the room suddenly felt occupied. The quiet was different. The space felt wrong, as though something had stepped into it without making a sound. I remember holding my daughter closer. I remember looking toward the hallway. I remember wanting to leave the basement immediately. Nothing else happened at that exact moment, but I did not want to stay there. I did not want to sit in that room with my baby and pretend I had not just watched a bag of diapers flip off a dresser by itself. After that, my fiancé and I made a decision. We moved our bed upstairs. It was not because we had proof that the basement was haunted. It was not because we had seen a ghost in full daylight. But we were exhausted. We had a newborn. We were already anxious. The basement had started feeling like the worst place in the house to sleep. So we moved upstairs. At first, it seemed like it might help. Being above ground made the house feel less closed in. We were closer to doors and windows. We were not lying under an empty floor anymore. We thought maybe a change of room would make us feel better. But the upstairs had its own problems. Our bedroom became completely overrun by spiders. I do not know whether that had anything to do with the other things. It may not have. Houses get spiders. Basements get spiders. Bedrooms get spiders. There could have been a crack somewhere, a nest nearby, or simply a seasonal reason they showed up. But it was not just seeing one or two spiders in corners. It felt like they were everywhere. On walls, near the baseboards, in corners, sometimes in places where I had checked only a short time before. The room began to feel invaded. I started becoming hyper-aware of every small, dark shape. Every mark on a wall looked like a spider at first glance. Every movement in the corner of my eye made me stop and look. Then, I began seeing something else. I do not know how to describe it without sounding completely insane. I kept seeing what I thought of as a spider person. It was not always standing directly in front of me like a real person. Sometimes it felt more like an image in my mind, something I could sense before I actually saw it. I would know where it was going to be. I would look toward a corner, near the bed, beside a wall, or somewhere dark in the room, and I would feel certain something was there. Then, I would see it. It looked crouched down. It had a human face and human hands, but it had too many limbs. 8 legs that started out like human legs, then bent wrong and broke into something more like spider legs. They were thin, bent at strange angles, and folded beneath it in a way that made my skin crawl. It was disgusting, not because it attacked us, not because it spoke, but because it watched. It would stare at my daughter and me at night. Sometimes I would wake up and feel like it was in the room before I even opened my eyes. I would lie there frozen, trying to decide whether I had actually seen it or only dreamed it. Then I would look toward the place where I somehow knew it would be. And there it was, crouched, watching. I tried to explain it away. Maybe I was exhausted. Maybe I was seeing shapes in darkness because I had become afraid of spiders. Maybe my mind was turning the stress of a new baby, the lack of sleep, and the real spider problem into something more frightening. I wanted that to be true, but my fiancé saw it too. That was what made it impossible for me to dismiss completely. He saw the same thing. He described it differently in small ways, because we were not looking at a clear, well-lit creature we could compare like a photograph. But he saw something crouched. He saw something human-shaped and spider-like. He saw the face. He saw the hands. He saw the limbs that did not look right. We had never sat down and invented a story about it together. We had not watched a movie and decided to scare each other. We were both simply trying to survive nights in a room where we felt watched. The spider person never physically touched us. At least, not that I know of. It did not crawl over the bed. It did not make noise. It did not leave obvious marks or damage. But it appeared often enough that we stopped treating it like a random nightmare. We would keep lights on. We would check corners. We would make sure our daughter was close. And no matter how many times we told ourselves it was probably stress or shadows, the room never felt completely safe. Then there was the doppelganger thing. That was the worst part. My fiancé would hear me calling for him in my voice. At first, he would think I was in another room. He would hear me say his name or call out to him in the same tone I normally used. Not distorted, not whispering, not obviously strange, just my voice. But when he went to find me, I had not called him. Sometimes I was asleep. Sometimes I was holding the baby. Sometimes I had been in the same room the whole time. I did not know what to make of it. The idea of something using my voice felt worse than seeing a shadow. A shadow could be lighting. A sound could be pipes. But a voice that sounded exactly like someone you loved was different. It felt personal. It felt like something was learning us. I began hearing things too. Not always clear enough that I could say I heard a full sentence. But sometimes I would think my fiancé had called from another part of the house when he had not. We would ask each other, "Did you call me?" So often that eventually we stopped asking unless the voice sounded completely clear. Then one night, something happened that still makes my stomach turn when I think about it. I was half asleep. I do not know what time it was. The house was quiet, and I was in that strange space between sleeping and waking. I was aware enough to know where I was, but tired enough that everything felt soft around the edges. Then I heard someone coming downstairs. I looked up. It was my fiancé. At least, it looked exactly like him. He came down the stairs the way he normally would. He moved with the same shape, the same height, the same familiar outline. I did not question it at first because why would I? It was my fiancé in our house. He came close to me. Then he kissed me. It was quick, normal enough that I did not immediately panic. I thought maybe he was checking on me. Maybe he had woken up. Maybe he was going somewhere in the house. Then I watched him walk toward the stairs. That was when I got up. I wanted to ask what he was doing. Maybe I was confused. Maybe I wanted to know why he had come downstairs. Maybe I wanted to ask if he heard something. I followed him toward the stairs. But there was nobody there. The staircase was empty. The upstairs was quiet. I looked around, expecting to see him just out of sight, but he was not there. Then I realized something worse. My fiancé was not even in the house. He had been gone. I do not remember exactly where he was, only that he had not been home at the time. There was no possible way he could have come downstairs, kissed me, and disappeared up the stairs before I reached them. I stood there, trying to make my mind accept it. I had seen him. I had felt the kiss. I had watched him walk away. But he was not there. That was the moment where I stopped feeling like we were dealing with random shadows, old house noises, or stress. Something had looked like him. Something had moved like him. Something had used his face well enough that I did not question it until it disappeared, and it had come close enough to touch me. After that, I was terrified of being alone in the house. I was afraid of the hallway. I was afraid of hearing my name. I was afraid of seeing my fiancé in a room when I knew he was somewhere else. I was afraid of looking into corners at night because I did not want to see the spider person crouched there again. We talked about moving. We talked about whether the house had a history. We wondered if something had happened there before we lived there. We wondered whether the basement, the wardrobe, the upstairs bedroom, or some part of the property had a reason for feeling wrong. But we never found an answer. We did not have proof. We did not have footage. We did not have someone else come in and see the same things at the same time. We only had our experiences. The shadow figures in the hall. The footsteps above us when no one was there. The bag of diapers flipping off the dresser while I was breastfeeding our daughter. The heavy feeling that filled the basement room afterward. The spiders everywhere upstairs. The thing with a human face, human hands, and bent spider legs watching us at night. The voices that sounded like me. And the thing that wore my fiancé's face long enough to kiss me before vanishing. I still do not know what any of it was. Maybe the house was haunted. Maybe we were stressed, tired, and scared, and our minds connected ordinary things into something darker. Maybe the spider infestation made us imagine the spider person. Maybe I was half asleep when I saw the doppelganger. Maybe my fiancé heard sounds that only resembled my voice. I know there are explanations people could suggest, but what makes it hard is that we both experienced things. We both saw things. We both heard things. And after our daughter was born, it felt like whatever was happening became more focused on our family. That was what scared me most. Not that something was in the house, but that it seemed to notice us, and that it seemed to notice our daughter. I do not know how long it lasted. Eventually, the activity slowed down. Maybe it stopped because we were no longer sleeping in the basement. Maybe it stopped because life changed, and we became less aware of every small sound. Maybe whatever was there lost interest. But for a long time, that house did not feel like a home. It felt like a place where we were staying while something else stayed there too.
So that's where we'll stop tonight. Before you go, remember this. Every story you just heard was real. Real people, real nights, and none of them saw it coming. If that got to you the way it gets to most people, do one thing before you leave. Hit subscribe. I post new stories all the time, and I don't want you to miss them. Take care of yourself. I'll see you next time.